For centuries, the Ottoman Empire had been a name spoken with fear. Its armies once stood at the gates of Vienna. Its fleets ruled vital sea routes. Its rulers commanded lands stretching across Europe, Asia, and Africa. By the middle of the 19th century, that reputation still lingered. From a distance, the empire looked intact. Its borders remained vast. Its capital still dazzled visitors. Diplomats arriving in Istanbul saw a city that appeared confident and alive. The waters of the Bosphorus shimmered under the sun. Ships moved steadily between continents, carrying silk, grain, and timber. Minarets towered above the skyline, calling the faithful to prayer. Palaces lined the shore, their white walls reflecting imperial pride. In the streets, life followed familiar rhythms. Merchants filled the markets with noise and color. Spices, cloth, and metal goods changed hands daily. Porters strained under heavy loads. Soldiers stood watch at gates and docks, reminders of authority and order, yet strength can be deceptive. Inside government buildings, anxiety ruled. Officials gathered around long tables covered with books of accounts. Page after page told the same story. Revenue arrived slowly. Expenses never stopped rising. Coins were counted carefully, then counted again. Each calculation revealed a shortfall. Taxes leaked away through corruption. Local governors delayed payments. Entire provinces contributed far less than expected. Beyond Ottoman lands, the world was changing faster than anyone in Istanbul truly understood. If you value stories that go beyond headlines and reveal the forces shaping nations, you are in the right place. At Polity Pictures, we explore the power, strategy, and history that define our world. Subscribe and stay with us as we uncover the stories that governments rarely explain and textbooks rarely simplify, because understanding power is the first step to understanding the future. In Western Europe, cities thundered with machinery. Factories ran day and night. Iron rails stitched regions together. Wealth expanded through industry, finance, and global trade. The Ottoman economy, by contrast, remained rooted in agriculture. Most subjects lived as peasants. Harvests depended on weather and luck. Productivity barely improved from one generation to the next. The empire faced growing threats. To the north, a powerful rival watched closely, waiting for weakness. Modern armies required modern weapons, training, and logistics. All of it demanded money. Tradition offered old solutions: currency debasement, confiscation of elite wealth, emergency taxes. These methods had worked in earlier centuries. Now they failed. The treasury was running out of options. What the empire needed was capital, large amounts of it, quickly. 4 generations, Ottoman rulers had resisted borrowing from foreign powers. There were fears of dependency. There were moral concerns. There was pride. But survival has a way of silencing hesitation. A door that had remained closed for centuries began to open. And once it opened, it could never be shut again. In 1853, the fragile balance finally broke. To the north, the Russian Empire moved with confidence. Its armies crossed borders and challenged the Ottoman authority. This was not a small border clash. It was a direct threat to the survival of the empire. The Ottoman army mobilized quickly, but war is not fueled by courage alone. Soldiers needed pay, weapons needed supplies, ships required maintenance. Every day of fighting drained the treasury faster than expected. Istanbul turned anxious. Messages arrived from the front lines demanding reinforcements. Commanders requested modern artillery and ammunition. Fortifications needed repair. Each request carried a price the empire could barely afford. The reality became impossible to ignore. The Ottoman Empire could not fight this war alone. Britain and France watched the conflict closely. They feared Russian expansion more than they feared Ottoman weakness. A Russian victory would shift the balance of power across Europe and the Middle East. So they intervened. Warships appeared in Ottoman waters. Allied soldiers landed on foreign soil. Publicly, it was a partnership. Privately, it was something else entirely. Alongside generals and admirals came financiers. The cost of war climbed rapidly. Gold flowed out of the treasury faster than taxes could replace it. Emergency measures failed. There was no hidden reserve left to tap. Advisors whispered what had once been unthinkable: borrow money. For generations, Ottoman rulers had avoided foreign loans. Debt meant dependence. Dependence meant vulnerability. Yet desperation leaves little room for principle. In 1854, the decision was made. Agreements were signed with banks in London and Paris. The documents were filled with unfamiliar language. Interest rates, issue prices, commissions. The loan was presented as assistance between allies. In reality, it came at a steep cost. The empire received less gold than it promised to repay. Large portions vanished into fees before reaching Istanbul, yet interest would still be paid on the full amount. Gold arrived and panic eased. Soldiers received wages. Supplies reached the front. The war continued. When victory finally came, relief spread through the capital. The empire had survived another crisis. The decision to borrow seemed justified. Few noticed what had changed. The empire now owed money to foreign banks. Payments would come due every year. Interest would accumulate regardless of harvests or politics. A new force had entered. Ottoman life, silent, patient, relentless. War had opened the door. Debt had stepped inside. When the war ended, the borrowing did not. Peace should have brought restraint, but instead it brought temptation. The arrival of foreign gold had changed how the empire viewed money. A signature in a distant office could summon wealth faster than taxes ever could. For the first time, relief came without reform. Officials no longer faced immediate consequences for inefficiency. Shortages could be covered, deficits could be delayed, difficult choices were postponed again and again. In Istanbul, confidence returned. The empire had survived war. It had secured powerful allies. Borrowing seemed less like a danger and more like a solution. New loans followed the first. Each agreement carried the same pattern. The empire received less than it promised to repay. Interest accumulated steadily. Commissions drained the treasury before the gold even arrived. Yet, the immediate effects felt positive. Debts were paid with new debts. Soldiers remained loyal. Court life resumed its splendor. Crises faded before they could force real change. The empire began to compare itself to Europe. Leaders walked through foreign capitals and felt humiliation. Gaslit streets, marble theaters, grand boulevards, these were symbols of modern power. They wanted the same image. Borrowed money was not invested in factories or schools. It did not modernize agriculture or increase productivity. It was spent on appearances. Prestige became policy. Lavish ceremonies returned. Foreign goods filled the palace. European fashions spread among the elite. The empire looked prosperous, even as its foundation weakened. The loans multiplied. With every agreement, the obligation grew heavier. Annual payments consumed larger portions of revenue. Still, the illusion held. Bankers were eager to lend. High interest promised high profit. They assumed the empire was too important to fail if danger arose. Powerful governments would intervene. This belief encouraged recklessness. By the early 1860s, the system had changed quietly but completely. The empire no longer borrowed to grow. It borrowed to survive. Old debts were paid using new loans. The treasury was running in place while the burden increased. What looked like stability was balance, maintained by constant borrowing, a fragile structure held together by paper and promises. For now, the gold kept coming, and as long as it did, few questioned the cost. The borrowed gold did not remain locked in vaults. It was meant to be seen. Ottoman rulers believed appearance mattered as much as strength. To the outside world, modernity had to be displayed. Power had to be visible in stone, marble, and gold. The old imperial residence no longer satisfied these ambitions. It spoke of tradition, not progress. It reflected centuries past, not the new European age the empire wanted to join. A decision was made to build something grander. Along the shores of the Bosphorus, construction began on a palace unlike any the empire had known. Its design mirrored European styles. Its scale aimed to rival the royal homes of the West. Materials arrived from across the continent, marble from Italy, crystal from Bohemia, gold leaf in astonishing quantities. Craftsmen worked endlessly, shaping luxury into every surface. The cost rose far beyond reason. While farmers struggled under heavy taxes and poor harvests, enormous sums were poured into decoration. Silk carpets covered vast halls. Staircases glittered with crystal. Chandeliers weighed tons. The palace stood as a monument to splendor. It also stood as a monument to debt. Each shipment of luxury was paid with borrowed money, each ornament added to future obligations. The empire displayed wealth it did not possess. The court celebrated the palace as proof that the Ottoman Empire belonged among the great powers of Europe. Foreign visitors were meant to be impressed. They were, but admiration did not pay interest. As construction continued, the treasury returned repeatedly to foreign banks. New loans replaced old ones. Payments came due faster than revenue could grow. Beyond the palace walls, reality worsened. Villages faced declining harvests. Infrastructure remained outdated. Little was invested in education or industry. The foundation of the state weakened further. Yet inside the palace, the illusion was complete. The empire looked magnificent, and magnificence masked decay. What had begun as emergency borrowing had turned into a lifestyle sustained by debt. The palace rose higher as the financial ground beneath the empire crumbled. By the late 1860s, the pattern could no longer be ignored. Money entered the treasury and left just as quickly. Interest payments arrived like clockwork, indifferent to weather, war, or politics. The empire owed more each year than the last. What had once felt manageable now felt suffocating. A growing share of state income vanished before it could be used. Taxes collected from distant provinces traveled not toward reform or defense, but toward foreign creditors. Farmers in Anatolia worked the land, unaware that much of their labor now served banks thousands of miles away. Fishermen paid fees that flowed out of the empire before touching local needs. The state began borrowing not for progress, but for survival. New loans no longer funded improvements or prestige. They were used to pay interest on old loans. The system fed itself, growing larger and more fragile at the same time. Officials turned to local financiers when foreign funds arrived too late. Short-term loans came with crushing interest. Desperation replaced caution. The debt tightened. More than half of the empire's revenue became tied to repayments. Little remained for the army. Ships went unfueled. Soldiers went unpaid. Maintenance was delayed again and again. Public confidence weakened. When people saw taxes rise while services declined, unrest followed. Provinces resisted authority. Rebellions flared. Suppressing them required money the state no longer had. Meanwhile, creditors remained calm. As long as payments continued, they had no reason to interfere. The empire was still useful as a debtor, but beneath the surface, the structure was unstable. One shock could collapse it. That shock arrived from two directions at once. Global markets faltered. Capital became scarce. At the same time, nature turned cruel. Drought struck the heartland. Crops failed. Hunger spread. Tax collectors returned empty-handed. Villages had nothing left to give. Yet the debt payments did not pause. The empire faced a choice with no good outcome. Sacrifice its people or break its promises. By 1875, the treasury stood empty. Years of borrowing had reached their limit. Foreign banks refused new loans. Confidence had vanished. The flow of gold stopped without warning. Inside government offices, panic replaced hope. Officials studied the numbers again and again, searching for a solution that did not exist. A massive payment was due soon. There was no money to meet it. Villages were already starving. Crops had failed. Livestock had died. Collectors returned with nothing but stories of hunger and desperation. The empire could no longer pretend. In October, a decree was issued. It announced that the empire would reduce its debt payments. Half would be paid in cash. The rest would be replaced with promises for the future. In careful language, it sounded temporary. In financial reality, it was bankruptcy. The news spread rapidly across Europe. Bondholders were stunned. Teachers, shopkeepers, and pensioners had invested their savings in Ottoman debt drawn by high returns. Now those savings were gone. Anger replaced sympathy. Newspapers accused the empire of dishonor. Political support evaporated almost overnight. The consequences were immediate. Without financial credibility, diplomatic protection faded. Allies distanced themselves. Enemies took notice. To the north, the Russian Empire saw weakness. The moment it had waited for had arrived. War followed. Ottoman soldiers fought with courage, but courage could not replace supplies. Many went unpaid. Equipment was outdated. Organization collapsed under pressure. Russian forces advanced relentlessly. They reached the outskirts of the capital itself. The empire was forced to accept harsh terms. Territories were lost. Influence vanished. Pride shattered. Where still, a massive war payment was imposed. A new debt was added to the old ones, larger than the empire could ever repay. The empire now owed more than it could earn. Sovereignty had slipped away quietly, carried off by numbers and signatures. The ruler remained on the throne, but the empire was no longer in control. After defeat, the empire waited for the worst. Many expected foreign armies to arrive and claim land outright. That was how empires had always fallen. But this time, conquest came in a quieter form. Instead of generals, representatives arrived. They carried documents, not weapons. They asked for meetings, not surrender ceremonies. Their demand was simple. They wanted control over money. In 1881, an agreement was imposed that reshaped the empire from within. It created a new authority responsible for managing Ottoman debt. This organization did not answer to the Sultan. It answered to foreign creditors. Key sources of revenue were removed from imperial control. Taxes on salt, tobacco, alcohol, fishing, and legal documents were no longer collected by the state. They were handed over. Foreign administrators took charge. Offices were established across the empire. Thousands of agents were hired to collect payments directly. Uniforms replaced traditional officials. Accounting replaced discretion. Efficiency replaced loyalty. For the first time in its history, the empire no longer controlled its own income. Money flowed outward automatically. No decree could stop it. No ruler could redirect it. If a farmer sold silk, a portion went abroad. If a fisherman sold his catch, foreign accounts were credited. Everyday life became a source of repayment. The system worked, revenue stabilized, creditors were satisfied, payments resumed with precision. But the cost was invisible and devastating. The state became dependent on what remained. With reduced income, it struggled to fund education, infrastructure, and defense. Progress slowed to a crawl. The rulers still governed ceremonies and symbols. Real power rested elsewhere. Decisions required approval. Ambitions were limited by available scraps. Independence existed in name only. The empire had not been invaded. It had been absorbed. Debt had accomplished what armies could not. While some powers were content to extract wealth, others saw opportunity. As Britain and France focused on repayment, a new influence emerged from the heart of Europe. Germany approached the empire with a different tone. It spoke of partnership rather than control. It offered respect instead of lectures. German leaders visited Istanbul. Promises were made. Friendship was displayed openly. The message was clear. Others wanted profit. Germany wanted cooperation. The empire listened. A grand project was proposed. A railway stretching across continents. Steel tracks would link Europe to the Middle East. Trade would flow faster. Troops could move quickly. Economic revival seemed possible. The idea ignited hope. Funding came through German banks. Engineers arrived. Construction began. Once again, loans flowed into the empire, but the terms carried hidden weight. Profits were guaranteed to foreign companies regardless of success. Resources along the railway route were claimed in advance. Oil and minerals became part of distant calculations. Control shifted again. Military advisors arrived alongside engineers. Training manuals changed language. Influence deepened quietly. By the early 20th century, the empire leaned heavily toward its new partner. Old creditors watched with concern. Balance turned into rivalry. Debt was no longer just economic. It was strategic. Europe drifted toward conflict. Alliances hardened. Tensions grew. Within the empire, leaders faced a grim reality. As long as foreign control over finances remained, independence was impossible. War appeared not as a disaster, but as an escape. If allies won, debts could vanish, control could be reclaimed. It was a desperate calculation, and desperation rarely ends well. When war finally arrived in 1914, the empire stepped into it with hope and fear intertwined. Leaders believed conflict offered a final chance to break free. If their allies prevailed, foreign control could be erased, debts could be dismissed, financial sovereignty might return. One of the first actions taken was symbolic and decisive. Foreign officials who managed the imperial revenues were expelled. Payments stopped. For a brief moment, the empire felt unshackled. But freedom born from war is fragile. The conflict proved devastating. Resources were scarce. Transportation was inadequate. Soldiers fought on multiple fronts under brutal conditions. Hunger spread, disease followed. Year by year, the empire weakened. By the time the fighting ended, the old state no longer existed. Territories were lost. Authority collapsed. The imperial system that had ruled for centuries was gone. Yet, the debt remained. When a new republic emerged from the ruins, it inherited more than land and people. It inherited obligations written decades earlier. Foreign powers returned, not with armies, but with ledgers. Negotiations followed. Terms were adjusted. Payments were reduced. They were not erased. For years, the new nation sent money abroad to repay loans taken long before its birth. Generations paid for decisions made under pressure and illusion. The final payment was made in the middle of the 20th century. A century after the first loan was signed, the burden was finally lifted. The lesson endured. Empires do not always fall to invasion. Sometimes they are undone by agreements signed in desperation. Debt reshapes power, quietly, patiently, and relentlessly. Sovereignty is not measured only by borders or flags. It is measured by control over resources, revenue, and future choices. The Ottoman Empire did not disappear in flames. It was claimed by compound interest. And that lesson continues to echo wherever nations believe borrowed money can replace strength. The world is changing faster than ever, and every nation carries a story that shapes the global balance. At Polity Pictures, we bring those stories to life through cinematic journeys into power, politics, and history. If you seek depth instead of noise, perspective instead of propaganda, this channel is for you. Subscribe and join us as we continue exploring the forces that move the world. The next story begins now.